All right. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you, everybody that has joined in to the 7 tips how to pass your supply chain audit with ease. I'll put on my camera here very briefly. Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Jenks. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Kodiak Hub, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm going to now turn off my camera, though, so we can focus in on the day's content. As I said, Sam, I'm the Chief Growth Officer here, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Richard Teuchler, who has been instrumental in building today's content. Thank you, Richard. He will also be aiding me in the background to answer some of your questions if you're popping them into the Q&A, but also to issue some very important polls. So make sure to keep those voting fingers ready. Lastly, we'll be joined, as I often am, by my third co-host, Charlie, the office dog. So if you hear a bark in the background, it's just Charlie adding his point of view to the day's content. And as I typically say, he can be rather opinionated. And if you've joined us for one of our sessions in the past, you know that he's not afraid to share his opinions. Short about Kodiak Hub, for those who don't know about us, Kodiak Hub is a cloud-based supplier relationship management suite that helps procurement and sourcing professionals just like you to build smarter and more sustainable supplier relationships with deeper buying insights in the form of robust ratings and analytics. Kodiak Hub provides an ecosystem and a modular suite that our users can be able to plug and play to manage supplier information, risk, compliance, performance, sustainability, and collaboration all from one place. During the course of today's webinar, you will all become more thoroughly acquainted with the Kodiak Hub solution and also better understand how the right processes and the right technology can get your supply chain audit ready. On to the agenda for today's webinar. During the next 30 to 40 minutes, I will try to thoroughly cover the following points, starting with the introduction, which we are in the midst of, moving into an area that I like to call getting audit ready, moving then into a section surrounding how you and your procurement, sourcing, and supply chain teams have the power and are currently holding that power to be able to get your supply chain audit ready, but you might not maybe have the tools to know how. So we're going to help you to try and get in that mindset today by ultimately getting into our 7 tips, how to pass your upcoming supply chain audits or your supply chain audits that you're running yourself internally with ease, really getting your supply chain audit ready. That is the focus of today's webinar, is to provide you with some practical tips of how to do so. And then we're going to get into a demo of Kodiak Hub to actually show application of how technology can be able to support a business looking to pass a supply chain audit with a little bit more ease than you might be having today. And then we'll finalize in a Q&A session at the end. So runtime of today's session, somewhere around 40 to 45 minutes. We'll see how things go. Without any further ado, let's get into the day's content. I myself was at a conference last week and there was about 30 odd speakers. So I wanted to share a little anecdote that maybe others have started to recognize. They held some speeches, and during the course of these 2 days, about 15 to 20% of the speakers said the exact same sentence. I asked ChatGPT what the definition of XYZ was. I mean, this sentence has begun to dominate every keynote or LinkedIn post that you're seeing out there. And I get it, right? I mean, creating content is hard. And I can sometimes, as we all can, feel relatively lazy. So I was actually going to start this webinar by doing the exact same thing. But instead of asking ChatGPT, I just asked our founder and CEO, Malin Schmidt. I asked her, in fact, what does it mean to be audit ready? Malin had a response that I found to be a great tone setter for this webinar. She said, getting audit ready isn't just an act of compliance, it's a means to enhance supply chain collaboration and performance. You know, whether you agree with this or not, risk and compliance management are necessary disciplines to ensure you'll be supply chain audit ready, but they're not the journey, the end destination of the journey, right? They're a means to be able to get to that end destination that you have in sight, which is ultimately to have a more collaborative and high-performing supplier base. Audit readiness as a whole requires really a mindset shift, as I see it, from being reactive to being proactive. If you think about it, audits have long been the consequence of identified risk. However, more progressive supply chains and supply chain teams where audit readiness is a theme throughout the supplier relationship management program are far outperforming traditional audit programs, which can be rather reactionary. Adopting a streamlined process and a proactive culture in the team for conducting supply chain audits is essential to adopting and aligning on organizational standards, safeguarding brand and shareholder value, driving competitive edge, avoiding cost of poor quality, improving supplier collaboration and performance, as well as then improving your overall customer satisfaction. The culture of proactivity is one that we urge everyone in this webinar to adopt if you haven't already. Seen here in this image from BSI, I think that it nicely illustrates the correlation that there is between audit readiness and supplier-based performance. This illustrates here that reducing the probability of disruption and increasing performance is best done by moving from a focus on supplier-based entry or some type of basic compliance to a place of commitment and cooperation within your buyer to supplier relationships. BSI also suggests that getting into a point of collaboration, cooperation, and maturity within risk and performance management of the supplier base requires engagement at a higher level, proactive enforcement of policies, corrective action planning and improvement plans, as well as then comprehensive intelligence in the form of tooling. And luckily, we're in a new era, right? We're in an era where you, within your procurement, sourcing, and purchasing teams, are in an increasingly powerful position. Just like a bell's curve, expectations and area of focus within procurement come and go, right? But the correlation in expectations versus resources during the past 2 decades has really widened the gap for procurement teams, putting a lot of organizations that you guys might also recognize this on your heels, right? About 2 to 3 decades ago, primary focuses were on cost, which progressed to segmentation and category management in the 2010s, right? Which progressed to globalization after the age of CrowdStrike, which then progressed to digitalization, and now we're in the age of ESG. Legislation and consumer demands driven by climate change macro trend have materialized itself in this focus on ESG. And getting your supply chain audit ready is really no matter anymore of kind of a nice to have, or no matter a matter of remaining compliant. It's about you living up to your corporate responsibility to set a new standard for the way that business is to be conducted at a global scale in global value chains. The greatest enablers to meet these increasing requirements and technology are technology, people, and process, right? The gap is growing, but with the right competencies, tools, and processes lies efficiencies. The application of these 3 items in parallel is a recipe for success and will be able to help you and your team to close the expectation resource gap. This might seem, pretty simple on paper, but the fact is that the expectations are growing. And as time continues, the FTEs and the resources in your team aren't. So you need to figure out different ways to be able to pull on efficiency. Because let's be honest, getting a supply chain audit ready isn't really an easy task, or it's not really a quick fix either. But with a solid framework, the foundation, and a sprinkle of modern solutions and best practices, you have a recipe to pass supply chain audits with ease. And at Kodiak Hub, our team and tooling have aided countless organizations to decrease the probability of supply chain disruption and increase supplier performance. So without any further ado, here are our 7 tips that hopefully will aid you to do exactly the same thing. What does it all start with? Well, we believe that it starts with process first. Remember, people, tech, and process, they're all important, but as a foundation to our 7 tips, it's important that we share a common framework for how to get your supply chain audit ready with proper supply chain due diligence, ensuring that you have enhanced supplier engagement and transforming basic compliance or entry into commitment and cooperation within your supplier base. This all starts with a good DD process, right? Clear requirements on process within your procurement team and towards your suppliers up front benefits everybody, right? Because when it's all said and done, audits should not be a policing activity. They should be seen as a trust building activity. And if you're able to build trust prior to that audit, then you place yourself and your supply chain in a good place. Third-party risk screening is a valuable starting point to land contextual, reputational, financial, and publicly available risk insights that might be related to your supply chain. From there, supplier self-assessment can help you to gather and understand and really unique set of business risks and opportunities that might be associated with a single supplier or a category of suppliers. It's important here not just to focus in on ESG requirements or compliance criteria, but to also focus on your unique business critical or industry specific assessment criteria. With the combined view of third-party risk and supplier engagement with response to your initial assessments, it's important to also review, to take time to segment and categorize. Tooling can help to automate this process, helping you to map potential risks, suppliers, but also to gear up for your audits. But it will also require a definition of your acceptance criteria prior to that within the assessment phase. Whether you plan to be the auditor or the audited, on site or at afar, right? An audit, and I think that this is important to remember, it's a pretty nerve-wracking activity, no matter how collaborative it might seem within its tone. So setting up a clear structure, a clear scope, arranging a formal startup meeting, executing on a clear, previously communicated agenda, issuing also comprehensive reports, both before and following an audit, according also to a good or standardized framework and format, will help everybody respect each other and will also then keep feelings in check and focus on the work product, which is in fact the outcome of the audit. What you ask to see and what is being investigated inherently will drive also change processes at the audited party. So make sure that you ask things that drive value from your perspective. This is best done by identifying areas for change and then also instituting or issuing corrective action plans so that audits just don't become a dead PDF report, but rather are a catalyst for improvements and collaboration with your suppliers. And the ultimate proof of great governance is also then improved performance. This is what makes the correlation between risk and performance so incredibly important. The best way to ensure your efforts to drive compliance, commitment, and cooperation in your supplier base is to follow output or empirical KPIs to see if the supplier is in fact delivering on target with your agreed SLAs. And this could cover both the quantitative, the harder facts, but also the qualitative, softer factors of supplier performance. And with that, I would like to pause for our first poll and ask everybody in attendance here, are you currently working with a clearly defined process, whoops, sorry about that, to mitigate risk and to get your supply chain audit ready? Please take the time to answer on screen now. The poll has been launched. Are you currently working with a clearly defined process to mitigate risk and get your supply chain audit ready? The answer responses are yes, similar to the one that was just shared now. No, of course, you lack the structure, or yes, but you don't have any good tooling in place to be able to support it currently. We'll wait for some more responses to roll in. Feel free to do so now. And it seems like it's a blend, but primarily people have a good process in place, which is fantastic to hear, right? It's one of the pillars of the process, technology, and people equation towards efficiency. but it seems as if the majority of those that not only have a process, but also the majority of those respondents, almost 50% of those that have responded, have a process but do not have any good tooling to support it. So we could, of course, talk about tooling later, but I think it's important that we keep talking about process, not only for those that lack the process, but also for those that have a good process, but maybe need some better tactics of how to be able to better implement it as well. So if we get into our second tip for the day, the 4 Rs. If you've attended some of our webinars before, you might already recognize the 4 Rs. It's something that we love to highlight because passing a supply chain audit and managing due diligence isn't really something that you can do on your own. Let's be honest. You need your suppliers to be engaged. Assessments and audits take time for you and your team to develop and execute, but they also take time to respond to. And the last thing that you want is for your suppliers to be questioning the importance of your governance activities. And to ensure that you are able to drive commitment and cooperation, you need to make sure that you make a good, lasting first impression. The 4 Rs is a great little tip to be able to check off on the different types of activities that you're doing to get your supply chain audit ready. Those are as follows. Starting with rationale. Make sure that your suppliers know the importance of engaging in the assessments and reporting that you're doing, right? Remind them that this isn't about you or me. It's about creating shared value and a new standard within the supply chain. Moving on to relevancy. Hold suppliers accountable for standards that are relevant in relation to their size, location, category, strategic importance, and other factors that you can think of, right? IT suppliers should not be responding to questions about reach and rows, just like packaging suppliers shouldn't be responding to items about data privacy or information security. Keep things relevant. Responsiveness. Make sure that you have a means to feed back sleek reports, whether it's the audit reports or assessment reports, to your suppliers. Based upon their input, they have a right to know where they need to improve and what they're doing well on, right? This is where modern solutions can also be able to help within the sharing of intelligence to suppliers. And lastly, the recognition piece. This is something that I think a lot of people forget about. It's important to not be afraid to highlight your top performers, post about them on social, highlight them in your sustainability report, mention them on or reward them in some way during annual supplier days or with some type of concessions in your upcoming negotiation. It's important to incentivize suppliers that are incentivizing you by collaborating closely. Moving into tip number 3 for the day, make sure that you're separating your practices from performance. And we'll get into what this means. It's important to gauge a wide range of environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria to make sure that your supply chain is audit ready. We know this, right? But one thing you don't want to start doing is to start mixing together business practices or levels of compliance without performance and results. We see this all the time when businesses are starting to utilize our solution, is the kind of hodgepodge capabilities within compliance versus performance. And this might be based upon a lack of process or lack of kind of not know-how or best practice. But having a supplier diversity program in place is very different from providing a breakdown, for example, of how much of a supply chain spend is in fact diverse. Having documented environmental management system in place is very different from actual waste figures or, use of water or electricity, right? Practices are one thing, performance is another. Try and keep them separated, and hopefully you'll be able to thank me later for it, all right? Moving into the next poll, I'm curious here. When I talk about practices and performance, are you following up on business practices and performance separately currently today? Or are you not? Are you following up maybe on one or only the other? Are you following up on both of them? Are you not following up on those KPIs? I'm curious. Take a moment to answer on the poll. Are you following up on business practices and performance separately? Again, at any point in time, if anyone has any questions during the session, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A, whether it's about the service or some of the content, and we will get around to them at the end of the session. Nice to see that most people are following up on both. Fantastic to hear, and I hope that you guys are also making sure to separate those in your measurement, but also then utilizing them to aggregate and get a holistic view. That's where the real knowledge about a supplier lies, and I'm sure that you guys that are doing so also recognize that, which is fantastic to see. Moving on then to our next tip for everybody in attendance. Number 4, segmentation. Centralized supplier contract spend control, it's difficult, right? We know this. And as the complexity of a supply network grows, so do also the challenges associated with a growing supplier base, such as like the decreasing supply visibility and increased supply chain risk as it becomes more global. It becomes less controlled. More risks start to seep into that supply chain. And classification and segmentation of the supplier base is really a necessary activity in that case in order to know not only who you buy from, but also why it is that you buy from them. We see that top performing procurement teams often have strong category expertise, but also well-segmented supplier bases beyond the category structure in order to power procurement agility, but also to focus on the relativity that we spoke about prior. There are plenty of segmentation methodologies and frameworks out there, but some of the most classic ones that we see are things related to CRALIC, spend, criticality, activation and qualification, approval status, risk profiling, performance profiling, or impact within the customer base or your top line value as well. If you don't have any segmentation or classification in place today, I'm sure that you do, but there might be some opportunities to get inspired by some peers as well. Don't be afraid to ask. It's always a good opportunity to do so. Moving into tip number 5, audit areas of increasing focus. I think that most people in attendance here today have a good idea of what it is that you're supposed to be following up on so that you are meeting your baseline requirements and baseline compliance, right? That's why you're in the job that you're in. But as I think we can all agree upon, getting a supply chain audit ready requires more of a robust 360-degree and a holistic understanding of supplier risk, compliance, and performance profiles. And those risks are just continuing to grow. So some risks that I just wanted to highlight, if you're not already keeping an eye on, are as following. Reputational risks. If your suppliers are experiencing shortages or delays or damage to goods, your customers will not know about your supply chain disruptions or that it's not you meeting the needs, right? While some of those customers might sympathize, most will probably go and find new business relationships if it continues to happen. And perception is in fact reality, right? While delivery and quality are vital, so are also the qualitative elements of supplier risk, such as media exposure. Your reputation is really closely tied to your supplier's actions. So make sure that you're following up on those types of risk elements. Geopolitical risk, right? This is something that's growing and growing. We know that following up on the different types of aspects, whether it's sanctions, blacklists, politically exposed persons, things that are in media, it's increasingly important to make sure that it's not coming back to hurt your brand. And we see this during the recent years, how the further tiers of the supply chain can be so important to keep an eye on in order to ensure that you're not working with the wrong people. Cybersecurity risk, it's one of the fastest growing B2B software as a service categories in the world, and with good reason, right? As the use of more complex and interconnected IT networks advance, technology and cloud computing, all of these areas continue to grow and really in an exponential way. So does the need to also address the cybersecurity, information security, and data privacy risks that are out there. And I'm sure that many of you guys are aware of that, but it's something, of course, to highlight as well. Moving into tip number 6. Understanding directives and legislation. Now, we know this, right? Supplier due diligence, supply chain audits. It's not so sexy, right? But it's essentially a building block for open and innovative buyer to supplier relationships. And the fact is, it's going to be the law if it's not already in your region. As we said at the beginning of this webinar, ESG is a factor that is here to stay, and we're in the age of ESG. It's being driven by consumer pressures, which has also then resulted in legislation. The primary legislation, if you don't already have an eye on them, that you need to keep an eye on are as follows, right? The Norwegian Transparency Act. There's others within the Nordics as well. LKSG, the German Supply Chain Act, CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, as well as then a subset of that, which is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive as well. These are all different types of legislations that have intensified in the past 3 years, been also then brought to actual realization in the last 3 years, and will continue to just grow within the following years as well. We're in the age of ESG, as I mentioned. And if your business falls into the category of exceeding 2 or more of the attributes listed on screen, the fact is that you will be subject to CSRD reporting, which is the more stringent and also the more wide sweeping of all of the directives or legislations that we just listed on the last slide. For German businesses, reporting requirements will already be enforced this year and then also next year, primarily on social aspects such as labor and human rights within the LKSG requirements. The timeline for CSDDD and CSRD directives offer a slightly longer window before they come into effect, but enforcement is also quickly approaching. So if you don't have an eye on these things, then make sure that you try and grab an eye on them. If you're interested in learning more about how these directives may impact your supply chain, Google EU Commission has fantastic materials on these aspects. Talk to the people that are working in risk and compliance in your business to understand how procurement and sourcing need to be able to align with the legislative requirements. We also ourselves hosted a webinar. There is also a German version of this webinar if you're in the German-speaking market as well, which we hosted back in March. And this is actually going to be a recurring webinar that we host once a quarter to be able to talk about how you can be able to not only address some of the legislative requirements, but also some ways to be able to stay ahead of the curve as well. The last tip, make it measurable. As the old adage goes, right? You cannot manage what you can't measure. I'm not going to transform into some type of McKinsey consultant now, don't worry. But making your supplier base's risk and performance measurable makes your collaborations more meaningful. Adopting a rating methodology or a measurement methodology can offer your procurement team a simple buying traffic signal, really, right? A RAG score, so to say. Stop and investigate, proceed with caution, and or go for it. Making things measurable requires first for your team to define supplier KPIs and acceptance criteria for what is excellent, good, satisfactory, or poor. This creates alignment internally on goals, but also externally, inherently towards suppliers as to what type of things they are expected to be doing if they're not already. And while rating suppliers may seem difficult, modern tooling makes it very simple. Once you've determined your KPIs, questions, and response values, you can assign weights. Simple 1 to 5 or red, amber, green scoring are fantastic first steps, and I'm sure that some of you guys have these things in place today. Our solution utilizes a 0 to 100 to provide a more nuanced rating profile. And supplier ratings really add procurement teams, aid your teams to have this additional layer to be able to spot risks and opportunities quicker, to flag up things so you spend less time on operational risk management and more time taking strategic decisions. Circling back to where we started this, auditing is not an act of compliance, and getting your supply chain audit ready is not an act of compliance. It is a means to drive collaboration and performance within your supply chain. So in the spirit of not just talking about it, but also being about it, I would like to switch over my screen now to some practical examples of how we could be able to support you in the Kodiak Hub solution. Before I do so, I do in fact want to finalize with one last poll, as we're only going to look into the solution probably about, we'll say, 5 minutes or so. If you want an extended demonstration of the solution, then please let us know now. Yes, if you would like one, then just go ahead and say yes. And if not, then please say not right now. Or if you're indifferent, then no worries. Just go ahead and wait until you see what you see in the next 5 minutes. and maybe we'll change your mind there about whether you'd like to see a demonstration or not. So please take a second to just vote on screen if you're interested in seeing a deeper demonstration. Following the webinar then, somebody from our team will be in touch with a link to a representative within your market or one that is alike to be able to book in a session with our team to be able to get a deeper dive 30-minute webinar or 30-minute demonstration of the solution. Now I'm going to switch over my screen here. Everybody's able to see my screen here, and here we can also be able to see, for example, our supplier data. There's a few different ways to be able to see supplier data. We can see in list format, we can see in map format as well, where we can also be able to see directly identify different types of macro or country related risks that are existing within our supplier base. Here we can also be able to, again, toggle over to the list view. This list view allows us to quickly be able to identify, for example, suppliers based upon their rating profiles, their approval status, their flagging status, so forth and so on. So we can be able to identify suppliers very quickly based upon their different typifications or segmentations, whatever those may be. When it comes to the supplier list overview, you can imagine this as your Excel spreadsheets on steroids, getting you out of them into a sleek overview, helping you to be able to manipulate the different data headings that you would like to. This is your supplier data when you're utilizing our solution. It allows you to be able to have presets and lists of your supplier data. So for example, I could at any point in time quickly find who are all of the ISO compliant suppliers within my supply chain. Well, I can always have that as a pre-saved list that I can pull up at any point in time to be able to dig deeper into if I would like to, for example. If I would also like to, I can be able to jump into an individual supplier scorecard at any point in time. These individual supplier scorecards are a 360-degree view of the supplier relationship. What they have here are then also the supplier data, right? Information linked to the supplier, but also a lot of insights that helps us to be able to make sure that a single supplier is audit ready and that we are also audit ready when somebody comes knocking on our door to see more insights about our supplier base. That's anything, for example, from different types of insights related to environmental, social aspects or alike. There's 14 different areas, which you see, for example, you do not need to follow up on all of those if you do not want to, for example, but are available for you to follow up on the business risks that might exist within your supply chain. There, for example, you can get back the values of your supplier data, whether it's documentation or just simple responses. And all of that documentation you can be able to find as well listed directly on a supplier scorecard. This type of data can also help you to directly spot when documentation is going to expire or has expired. It can also give you notifications to ping, not only the supplier, but yourself to make sure that everybody's able to see when things are running out. Again, keeping you in line to make sure that you're audit ready, not missing then the expiration of documentation or your contracts as well, which can also be managed in the platform. Note-taking capabilities, well, those exist within the solution. This is a nice functionality internally. So I could be able to leave a note for myself or for other users, and directly listed there is a audit trail of who it is that's left this note, as well as then a little bit of when it is that was left. I can expand upon some of the third-party insights on the right-hand side related to financial, media, but also then that sanctions and blacklist risk. I'm not going to dive super deep into those aspects today. The last thing that I wanted to show also on this page was that any type of prior self-assessments, audits, or performance evaluations, I can be able to quickly pull forward and see the results of those individual reports. This is allowing me to be able to not only share those reports with suppliers if I toggle over to those reports, but it also allows me at any point in time to quickly be able to show these results to an external body that might want to be seeing them. And of course, I can be able to also utilize this and leverage the tooling to quickly spot where suppliers are or are not compliant. Again, letting the solution help us with the aspects related to entry and compliance so we can focus on the aspects related to commitment and cooperation with our supplier base. The last bit is then the intelligence. And the analytics and reporting capabilities in our solution also helps you to get your supply chain audit ready, with helping you to not only be able to visualize certain supplier data so you can be able to spot inconsistencies or where suppliers are doing well, but also based upon, for example, things like documentation. So you can identify quickly who is or is not as well compliant with certain types of requirements that you have on the supplier base, and also to be able to address those things within our action space where you can be able to manage corrective actions in a portal between you and a supplier to actually be able to develop upon that relationship and ultimately evaluate the performance as well within our solution. So this full due diligence and lifecycle management of the supplier base is capable or is part of the capabilities that's in the solution. And again, what I would like to do now is just simply toggle back on that last poll that we had up. And based upon the little teaser, if you'd like to change your response or update a response, if you're interested in getting a deeper demo, go ahead and respond now, yes or not right now. And at that point in time, I want to thank everybody for your attendance. But before you leave, let's throw up the Q&A slide so everybody knows what time it is. If there are any questions, then please shoot. Pop those into the Q&A section now, and we will make sure to get around to them in due time. If you have any questions, about the contents of today, any additional tips that maybe you have missed out on, or things that you would like to add to the content for the rest of the attendees, but also if you would like to know anything more about our services, take the time and pop a question into the Q&A right now.